Hi there, welcome to the Bowery Boys. This is Greg Young.
And this is Tom Myers. And in today's show, we're talking about Madison Square Park, a place that was really at the heart of Gilded Age New York. Whether you were rushing off to an upscale restaurant like Delmonico's, or for a night of the theater, or maybe just an evening at one of New York's hottest hotels, because for many, many decades, Madison Square Park was the epicenter of New York City's culture.
And the evidence is all around here today. The park is surrounded by some of New York's most renowned architecture, from the Flatiron Building to the Metropolitan Life Tower, which was once the tallest building in the world. It also lent its name, of course, to one of the most famous sports and performing venues in the world, Madison Square Garden.
Which today is no longer located anywhere near the park, but we'll get to that in a bit. But after living large during the Gilded Age, Madison Square Park had a bit of a tough run during the second half of the 20th century. It fell into disrepair and even developed a dangerous reputation by the early 1990s.
But it is a very different story today. And in fact, the area has again become so trendy that the streets north of the park have developed into its own historically protected micro-neighborhood called NoMad, or North of Madison. Today's surroundings probably have more in common with the 1870s than they do with the 1970s.
Today, we're bringing you the glamour, architecture, sports, scandal, drama, dolls, and even dogs as we explore all that happened in Madison Square Park. We are talking today about Madison Square in Manhattan, which contains Madison Square Park, which is a lovely 6.2-acre leafy oasis that today contains, winding paths and grassy lawns, several monuments, rows of park benches, usually some kind of an art installation is happening. And yes, also a very popular Shake Shack.
And that is a very important detail. And believe it or not, that Shake Shack is historic itself.
It's
true. We'll get to that.
Now, the square is bordered by East 26th Street to the north and East 23rd to the south, and on its eastern edge by Madison Avenue, and along its western edge by Fifth Avenue. And there is a little bit of Broadway where it cuts through the southwest corner of the square, sort of snipping off a little triangle.
So this is where Broadway intersects with Fifth Avenue and 23rd Street. We know that where Broadway hits all of these avenues, breaking up the grid plan, it makes for some very interesting little triangular plazas.
Right. Most of which were then developed into squares, or at least into some kind of interesting plaza, like Union Square or Herald Square.
Most famously, Times Square.
Even Columbus Circle, where Broadway hits 8th Avenue. Doesn't get a whole lot of love, but still, that's Broadway hitting an avenue.
But before we had a grid plan here in Manhattan, before the Commissioner's Plan of 1811, what sat here?
Well, way back, before the European settlers arrived, this was a Lenape hunting ground. It was covered in trees and vegetation. And then in the early New Amsterdam days, the area would be mostly farmland and sort of, sandy and swampy fields. Today's square, that area was crossed from east to west by a stream that was called Cedar Creek. And by about 1680, all of the land on today's western edge of Madison Square was actually owned by a formerly enslaved man named Solomon Peters. It had been granted to him by Sir Edmund Andros, who was the British governor of New York in 1680, for whom he worked. The author Christiane Bird writes about this in her 2022 book, A Block in Time, A New York City History at the Corner of 23rd and 5th Avenue.
Wow, so this is going way back, long before the blocks were laid out, of course.
Yeah.
He owned what would be the whole western side?
Yes, his farm plot stretched 30 acres from what is today 21st Street up to 26th Street and from Broadway all the way west to between 6th and 7th Avenue. So yeah, that whole western side of the square itself and, so much more. And then next to it, on the site of the inside of today's park, much of that land had been given over to the city. Much of that land was given over to the city by the British in 1686 in the Dongan Charter, which we really don't talk enough about on the show, Greg. But this was a charter that included land in the middle of the island from 23rd Street all the way up to about 90th Street. So the city then leased a lot of that land out to farmers who mostly let their animals graze here, in the middle of the island.
So the British said that they owned it and then they gave it to the city.
Yes.
Okay. So this does all sound very bucolic, however. How did people from New York, which was, very far away, how did they even get to this area?
Well, there were roads and paths, that headed up here. In 1703, along the edge of the Peters property, the city made one of these old paths into a new road that led northwest up to the village of Bloomingdale at today's 114th Street. And they called this road the Bloomingdale Road.
And that road goes by another name today, Broadway.
Yes.
But where did Bloomingdale Road start?
Amazingly, right here at 23rd Street and 5th Avenue, where it hooked in and joined the Bowery.
The Bowery? What?
Yeah.
How does that work?
But years later, that section of the Bowery that headed southeast from 23rd Street would also be renamed Broadway. So yeah, for much more on that story, I recommend reading Fran Ledden's fabulous book, Broadway, A History of New York City in 13 Miles. And I even interviewed him for a show about that in 2018. But the Peters family sold off their land then in 1716, by which time, as Bird writes in her book, times had changed and new racist laws called the Black Code of 1712 now made it illegal for the Peters family to legally pass their property on to their own children. And so they sold it to a man named John Horn and his brother-in-law. And the Horn family then would hold on to this land for a couple of generations, and they would build a large home, a homestead really, for themselves just south of the intersection of today's 23rd and 5th Avenue. So their home was basically stood in the middle of today's 5th Avenue.
So I can imagine things got a little awkward for homeowners, although maybe lucrative for some homeowners, as the Commissioner's Plan of 1811 came along, which carved up most of Manhattan Island into streets and avenues. But also in that plan, there just weren't a lot of public spaces, surprisingly. Certainly not that many parks.
No, well, with the exception of a very large parade ground that was in the plan, that in that 1811 plan covered an enormous space, 275 acres, including land right here. I mean, this parade ground was huge. It was supposed to cover all of the land between 23rd and 34th Streets and between 3rd and 7th Avenues.
Yeah, unfortunately, in 1811, there would have been a lot of people already living in this region that I guess was now being cleared away for a parade ground.
Yeah, that was the problem. They wanted this, parade ground for military training and obviously also to give, residents a nice place to stroll. But the city couldn't afford to buy up all that land. And so they had to shrink it down 3 years later. They went from 275 acres down to 90 and renamed it Madison Square Park, named for President James Madison.
Madison, who was president at that very same time.
That's right.
Actually, that's interesting. So did you say the park was 90 acres? Today it's just 6.
Right. 90 acres was the plan on paper. But as you pointed out, it was still way too costly for the city. So in 1828, the city cut this planned park way down to only 6.8 acres, which is roughly the size of the square today.
and correct me if I'm wrong, but the park didn't actually exist yet, right? It's still very conceptual. It's on paper.
Right.
So when did they actually, clear the land and build it?
Well, it wouldn't officially open as a park for another 20 years or so, but there already was a military arsenal located on the space at about today's 5th Avenue and 24th Street inside where the park is today. And east of that was a potter's field at the time, in which many poor New Yorkers had been buried prior to 1797, at which point they opened up a newer potter's field down the island in today's Washington Square. But that arsenal then, in the 1820s, as the city was, pulling together its plans for this future park, that arsenal would be converted into the New York House of Refuge, which was a home for boys and girls, which would stand there until it burned down in 1839.
But it would be rebuilt just like in a different area down by the East River.
That's right. So as all of this was happening, Fifth Avenue was also being laid out just next to the park. Now, it had been staked out by the commissioner's plan, but it wasn't open as a road, from 21st Street up to 42nd Street until 1837.
Thanks to the commissioner's plan, the house was now in the middle of Fifth Avenue, right? Yeah. It couldn't just stay in the middle of Fifth Avenue, and they couldn't build around it.
Well, actually, for a little while, it did stay there with horse-drawn traffic just kind of swerving around it.
Oh.
And that was happening all over the island. Mm-hmm. But finally, in 1839, it would be rolled up to the corner of 23rd and 5th Avenue, about where the little triangle is located across from the Flatiron Building today.
I am always amazed when we get to a part of the history where you start rolling buildings by logs. So they put this building on logs and they just rolled it.
Just gave it a push. It was a whole business. We definitely need to do a show on that. Wow. But the Horn family then rented out this old home in the 1840s to a man named William Thompson, who then converted it into a tavern that he called Madison Cottage.
And this cottage was actually quite well known as this kind of stopping over place for travelers as they were heading into and out of town, because this wasn't really in New York City yet, really. You could grab a drink here and even a bed for the night.
Yes, according to the book, Incredible New York, High Life and Low Life of the Last 100 Years, by Lloyd Morris, the tavern had posted a few rules on the wall, including a sign that stated, quote, "No more than 5 people to sleep in one bed."
Interesting rule.
What happened at Madison Cottage
stayed at Madison's Cottage. Underscoring, though, just how north of the city, this was at this point.
Yes, even though the city was quickly catching up and moving up around it. And throughout the 1830s, the city was finally spending the money to drain the old streams in the park and level out the land and then fence it in. And finally, the Madison Square Park opened in May 1847.
So finally, we have a park. But what's happening around it? Because by then, this is a big decade for New York City. The population is greatly increasing by the 1840s.
Yeah, 1840s, 1850s, these, boom times for the economy and for the population due to Americans, migrating to the city for jobs, and of course, foreigners immigrating to New York, especially Irish and Germans at the time. So New York City went from a population of about 312,000 in 1840 to 515,000 in 1850. And as we have covered in many other shows, residents who could move up the island away from all that hustle and bustle and industry did so. So by the time that the park officially opened in 1847, most of the plots surrounding the park were residences.
Turning this former pasture and farmland into a normal neighborhood, even slightly upscale by this point, and getting pretty busy, I might add.
In part, yes, thanks to the new Madison Square Depot, that opened in 1845 on its northeast corner between Madison and 4th Avenue, or Park Avenue, and between 26th and 27th Streets. That depot belonged to the New York and Harlem Railroad, whose passengers could come down the east side of Manhattan, and from Harlem and the Bronx, down to 32nd Street, where they would then transfer to horse carriages and continue down to this depot at 26th Street. And then from there, they could, continue down the island on horse cars.
And I would say that this block that you're talking about with the depot on it is very important to our story. So remember this block, put your flag in it. So we've got commuters and also residents living in brownstones that are being constructed, walking through the park, heading downtown to jobs via horse and carriage.
Yes, and we also have other institutions that are opening around the park, in nearby blocks to serve these locals, like all the churches that opened in the 1850s alone, including the lovely little church around the corner, the Church of the Transfiguration on 29th Street, and also Trinity Chapel, which is today's St. Sava, and the nearby Marble Collegiate Church on 5th Avenue, and of course, the Madison Square Presbyterian Church, which was designed by Richard Upjohn in the Gothic Revival style and opened on the park at Madison and 24th Street in 1854.
Okay, so lovely churches are now sprouting up here, but I've also read that the locals made some sports history even around this time.
Ah, yes. You mean when some neighborhood residents came together at an empty lot on Madison and 27th Street in 1842 to form the Knickerbocker Baseball Club. And as the New York Times pointed out recently, they played a variation of several English ball games, including Rounders, the game Rounders, and their leader, a man named Alexander Cartwright, helped codify the rules of their game into something that resembled modern baseball.
Wow. So in another reality, a huge baseball stadium might have opened on the spot, but the Knickerbockers could only play here for a few years because, these vacant lots were going fast.
They were, and they lost that vacant lot and had to move the game over to Hoboken in 1847.
The Hoboken Knickerbockers. Doesn't make any sense to me. It has an odd ring, let's just say.
A very odd ring. But by the end of the 1850s, with the city's population surging, Madison Square Park started to feel, a little bit like the park that we know today. It got its first monument in the 1850s, just actually outside its gates. The Worth Monument, which is a 51-foot-tall granite obelisk that is above the grave of Major General Jenkins Worth, who was a war hero. And the monument still stands there today on the western side of 5th Avenue near 25th Street. So we've got monuments, we've got baseball, we've got walks in the park. But there was also something else happening here in Madison Square in the 1850s. Greg, remember Madison Cottage at the corner of 23rd and 5th?
But that's 5 to 6 people in a bed rule? Yeah, whatever.
No more than 5.
no more than 5. Okay, all right.
Well, in 1852, it was demolished and replaced by an impressively large arena and a showplace called Franconi's Hippodrome.
Oh, I love the era of hippodromes. We don't have enough hippodromes in our lives.
No.
A more famous one would actually be built up further in Midtown later in the century. Franconi staged elaborate spectacles. That is what a hippodrome is for, right?
Oh, with enormous casts, right, of humans and animals. I mean, we're talking like elephants. They staged chariot races. The place could seat 10,000 people, which, just to give it a little perspective, today's Madison Square Garden seats just under 20,000 in the main arena. So Franconi's was half the size in 1852. I found an ad in the Daily Herald on August 7th, 1854, Franconi's Hippodrome, fine athletic exhibition. They were advertising a half-mile race around the track that they were holding. That was 6 times around the track. and handing out cash prizes of $40, $20, and $10 to the fastest runners, which is, that's like $1,500 for first place.
So this is like a major attraction.
Yeah.
Up here. This is huge. By the way, I don't even know if I could make it around the track 6 times, by the way.
You could for $1,500.
Maybe.
Or maybe you would rather just buy a ticket, to witness what happened before the race, which was a, quote, magnificent entertainment embracing vivid illustrations of the classic games, thrilling representations of the manly sports of the chase, together with a full program of all the other daring splendors of the hippodrome. Greg, I think they're talking about some sort of Olympic-themed manly tableau vivant that was taking place.
So a bit like a 19th century Busby Berkeley going on here at Madison Square.
I'm thinking pure tableau vivant. That's what I want. I want Olympic tableau. But the advertisement also reminds us of something else. Seats in the boxes went for 50 cents, while seats in the, quote, colored boxes went for 26 cents. We can't overlook the fact that while black and white audiences may have attended together, they still had segregated seating.
And that would continue for many decades in the city, of course. But this Franconi's Hippodrome sounds like a very expensive operation to run.
Yeah, it turns out that hippodromes are really expensive to run if you're not Caesar Augustus. So Franconi's closed after 2 years and would soon be replaced by something much more, shall we say, hospitable.
We'll get to Madison Square in the Gilded Age after this. Just a quick reminder to click subscribe to the Bowery Boys podcast. That way you don't miss an episode.
We're releasing new episodes all the time, including a brand new episode every 2 weeks.
And to become part of the show, join us over at patreon.com/Bowery Boys. We have a ton of perks, including exclusive audio. Our patron support makes this show possible.
And we would love to also have you join us on one of our walking tours at BoweryBoysWalks.com. You can join a public walking tour or book a private one all to yourself.
So you left us with a proper park, finally, surrounded by light residential development, but things were about to go heavily upscale here. But New York, which was once contained down at the tip of Manhattan Island, was growing northward.
And Madison Square had the fortune of being right next to Fifth Avenue, which by the mid-19th century, as we've spoken about in countless shows, was the spine of New York high society, lined with the mansions of the most wealthy New Yorkers. And that was crawling northward up the island, so that by the 1860s, they had finally made it to the area around Madison Square.
So by the time of the Civil War, the north side of the park was lined with brownstones. As you mentioned, they were popping up already, and they were all uniform in design, as brownstones in New York often are. But there was one interesting and exceptional home just south of that depot, the 6-story mansion of one Leonard Jerome, the financier known as the King of Wall Street and the business partner of Cornelius Vanderbilt, who, of course, owned the depot.
Right. And we should add that Leonard Jerome was the father of Jenny Jerome, and thus the grandfather of Winston Churchill.
Yes, that's some notable context to add here. That's right. But this was much, much more than just a house. It had its own theater, as one does, and stables with stained glass windows, I guess, to delight the horses while they were inside. And then, of course, within the house, to quote Tom Miller from the website Daytonian in Manhattan, quote, "The breakfast room could accommodate 70 guests, and the white and gold ballroom boasted 2 fountains, one spouting champagne and the other cologne."
Be careful which one you dip your flute into. That could be...
At least your breath would smell nice, I guess. Yes.
Wait,
two
did they
really
drink out of the fountain?
I don't know. I can't even conceive of what these would have smelled like or looked like.
This sounds like a party trick. Maybe I can't imagine that it was a permanent fixture of the mansion.
A cologne fountain. All right. Well, anyway, the house would eventually become the clubhouse of the Union League. And it's in that context that we've mentioned the Jerome Mansion on a previous show before, for this is the rumored location for the invention of the Manhattan cocktail.
Wait, wasn't that an urban legend, by the way?
Well, probably, yes.
But still,
yes.
A tasty one. We'll let it go. Much tastier than cologne, by the way. But so that's the official drink of Madison Square.
Yes, not cologne, the Manhattan.
But wait, we've really come far from the story of Madison Cottage and baseball. If we're already talking about mansions and cocktails, what's happened?
Although I would say that it's not the residential homes that would make the reputation of Madison Square Park, but rather the hotels that would sweep through. In the tradition of the Madison Cottage, actually, the first major example comes in 1859 with the construction of the Fifth Avenue Hotel, which is a 6-story white marble palace built upon the spot of the former Franconi's Hippodrome and all those tableaux vivants. They're gone. Here's the Fifth Avenue Hotel. Now, what's kind of innovative about this, many of the great hotels at this time were further south on Broadway, right? So it was kind of a risk for its developer, Amos Richard Eno, who was a successful merchant who was just now speculating really into the real estate craze of the time.
And this was a risk in the mid-19th century because, still many people in New York considered 23rd Street to be way too far north of the center of the city. It was miles from Wall Street and City Hall. Who was going to stay up here?
Well, a lot of people, actually. It ended up being a fabulous success. In fact, it was actually geared towards the comforts of Wall Street brokers and politicos and politicians, so much so that its public rooms and dining spaces became places of wheeling, dealing, backroom deals. These back rooms were the places where those deals were done. And in terms of its influence over the park, the hotel is important for another reason, because the Fifth Avenue Hotel also had upscale shops, both outside at street level and even inside.
Which was, that was a pretty bold innovation, because up until now, Fifth Avenue, had been known for being mostly, exclusive residences. And suddenly here, they had hat shops and chocolate shops and there were barbers to trim your whiskers or what shape your handlebar mustache, whatever they were wearing at the time.
And because the entrance of the hotel faced into this small triangular plaza, next to the park, there was the Worth Monument there. It created a kind of open public space where people could gather and gallivant even. Very quickly, this became a center of culture, of entertainment, really a sort of Times Square of the 1870s. And soon theaters, burlesque houses, they even opened up here around the park. And you had other glamorous hotels like the Brunswick Hotel at the northwest corner of the park, which opened in 1864. Then the Albemarle and the Hoffman House, another major one, at Broadway and 25th, which opened in 1870.
And just to underscore that these were more than hotels, more than places where you went to, get a room for the night. They also played a part in the city and the nation's, political and financial and social scenes. This area, Madison Square, really became the New York hub of national politics.
In fact, the Fifth Avenue Hotel was chiefly associated with Republican politicians, and the Hoffman House with Democratic politicians just on either side of this triangular plaza. In our show last year on Samuel Tilden and the presidential election of 1876, we actually discussed the political importance of Madison Square backroom politicking.
Yeah, it's not an exaggeration to say that the course of American politics during the Reconstruction era was actually manipulated right here in these hotels on Madison Square.
And so naturally, all these political shenanigans worked up quite an appetite. So all of these hotels, of course, had the absolute best restaurants. All these politicians were fed quite well. Madison Square was soon known for fine dining.
Some things haven't changed.
Yeah, I know. And even New York's most famous restaurant, Delmonico's, got into the act. Now, this name, Delmonico's, they had started in Lower Manhattan and are often credited with introducing French fine dining to the United States. By the 1870s, it was the place for society to dine. And so naturally, when the Madison Square area became the domain for high society, Delmonico's had to follow, opening at 5th Avenue and 28th Street in 1876, with an interior that rivaled the great banquet halls of Europe. The New York Daily Herald was there when it threw open its doors in September of that year. Quote, "A steady stream of celebrities, social, plutocratic, artistic, journalistic, legal, and every other shade of professional gentlemen, including a sprinkling of the clerical, poured through the doors of the cafe and sauntered in and out, hat in hand, all over the beautiful building. The soft, yielding carpets, the costly gildings, the rich paper on the walls, the sumptuous silver service, the solid rosewood and oak paneling of the main dining room and cafe, all were admired in their turn by the visitors and old customers." Unquote.
Back in the days when the soft, yielding carpets merited a mention in the newspaper. So all of a sudden, then, we've got world-class hotels and restaurants where they had just been playing baseball a few years before. Was everything around the park so fancy?
Well, maybe around the park, but the actual park itself was really seen as kind of raggedy in the 1860s, especially compared to that brand new, spanking new Central Park that was up north, right? You couldn't compare. But by the time Delmonico's threw open its doors in the 1870s, the park had received a major redesign, courtesy of a celebrated Austrian horticulturalist named Ignaz Palat. He worked for Frederick Law Olmsted on the gardens of Central Park and then moved on to remaking pre-existing parks and parade grounds throughout the city, including Washington Square Park. He worked on Mount Morris Park in Harlem. And in 1870, he redesigned Madison Square Park, giving the park a more formal design, but also adding a couple fascinating features that purposefully break up the city's sometimes monotonous grid plan. This grid plan that's hanging over the whole show here so far. And I bet, Tom, that you don't really even notice these two innovations unless you actually know where to look.
Oh, how intriguing. Fascinating features that break up the grid. Like what exactly?
So originally, he had wanted to design the park around two fountains on the north and the south ends. Although there's only the south one would eventually be built. And on the north side today, there's actually like a reflecting pool. But imagine that's where a fountain was supposed to be, okay? But the paths towards these areas, and in fact, the pathways throughout the entire park, are all slightly curved. To quote from park historian Mariam Berman in her book, Madison Square, the Park and Its Celebrated Landmarks, quote, "There were no paths to take one directly across the park. Instead, meandering and intertwining paths invited one in and gently led one around and through, giving the illusion of a park much grander in size. One would be unlikely to repeat subsequent walks in exactly the same pattern," unquote.
That is so true. You can't just cross diagonally through the park, can you? They force you, right? They force you to stroll.
Yes. And the second major change specifically involves the west side of the park, where 23rd Street, Fifth Avenue, and Broadway technically converge, right? That's a major intersection. From a bird's eye view, or I guess a drone's eye view today of the park, it kind of looks as though that corner of the park has been lobbed off, sort of cut off and discarded, right? It's because of this big intersection, which was always a traffic nightmare, and even more so in the 1860s, with a sudden swell of horse-drawn carriages and omnibuses.
Especially as they were all trying to get to those new hot hotels and the restaurants. And there was, shall we say, very little traffic enforcement.
Almost no traffic enforcement, really. And so the area of the park closest to this intersection, that southwest corner in this new design, was essentially whittled away. It was widened for traffic. It creates a little bend today, it's still there. It's a little bend. Although most of that expanded roadway today, we don't have horses and carriages anymore, but it's been converted into a bike lane.
Ah, yes. I've used that bike lane. But but back to the Gilded Age, that little corner was where you would then raise your arm to hail, a handsome cab. It's all just so picturesque, right? The line of horses and carriages. And we see it, in some of the most romantic paintings and then later photographs that captured Gilded Age New York.
It's like a perfect view of the Gilded Age right here at this particular corner. And did you mention raising your arm, like hailing a handsome cab or whatever?
Cab, yeah.
Well, the park was appropriately the home then of one of the largest arms in the world in 1876. The right arm and torch of the Statue of Liberty mounted on a pedestal.
That was a hard pivot. Or that was a... That was quite a transition, Greg.
Yeah.
But yes, talk about something hard to imagine. I mean, basically, the flaming torch was from the Statue of Liberty was being held high above the tree line of the park, right? On the northwestern end of the park. But it wasn't just here. This was obviously before it was, she was mounted in New York Harbor. This arm wasn't here as a tourist attraction.
Although, I should add, it was a tourist attraction. You could actually go in it. You could climb to the top of the torch for 50 cents. It was a site. I
mean, yes, right, of course. But this was part of a fundraiser that the architect Frederick Bartholdi was using, to drum up funds and enthusiasm, for the statue itself and to ship the rest of the statue over. And find it a home here in New York. So it sat here for many years. You could say that it was the fundraising arm of the Statue of Liberty.
It's amusing to think of this time, when the statue was not the statue, where it lacked the reverence and the symbolism that it holds today. People can, and so some of the press were having a little fun with it. They were a little skeptical, by what this was, this whole sudden erection of a stray arm in a park. According to the New York Times, quote, "The arm has been placed on a pedestal in Madison Square where it has excited the warm admiration of the infants who infest the place. It is proposed to erect the two legs of the statue at one of the entrances of the Central Park. Persons who pass between the shadow of two titanic legs will undoubtedly be filled with all sorts of lofty emotions. But it must be confessed that a pair of detached legs, having no body or a skirt, will fail to satisfy those who insist that art should faithfully copy nature. It would probably be better to place the legs upside down in the middle of the Central Park Lake. By a little stretch of the imagination, the spectator could then fancy that Liberty had drowned herself." Unquote.
Come on.
Unquote.
That is so weird. It's so weirdly, vicious. It almost seems sacrilegious to us today, right? Yes. Yeah. Come on. I'm sure it must have actually been quite lovely to visit Lady Liberty's arm in Madison Square in the day.
And the arm was there until 1882 when it returned to Paris to be assembled, of course, into the final statue, which would then be returned in pieces in its entirety to New York Harbor in 1886.
I wonder if they had to clean it off. I mean, they probably had to.
I'm sure they gave it a fine polish, yes. So imagine the scene here around the year 1880, right? At night, which we've described here. The hansom cabs, the Arm of Liberty, the enchanting little park paths, the hotels, the restaurants, and now add in all the visitors. Mostly women, shoppers, in fact, who frequented the many department stores along Broadway and along 6th Avenue, this area that would become known as Ladies' Mile.
Truly the hustle and bustle of New York at the time, really, the center of social activity in the 1880s.
Next, imagine it illuminated by the harsh glow of 160-foot arc lamps high in the sky that were stretching up Broadway from Union Square here to Madison Square, where they were attached to a large generator on 25th Street, lighting up all the side streets. From the New York Times, quote, horses, streetcars, omnibuses, and passing pedestrians were lighted up with a brilliancy which, though by no means equal to the light of day, was sufficiently strong for all practical purposes. The grouped burners in Madison Square with their rows of gas lights below and a single electric flame above, viewed from afar, suggested a circlet of golden gems surrounded by a dazzling white diamond, unquote.
Ooh. Sounds enchanting. Although I think that we know, from previous shows that those arc lights could actually make people look in reality quite sickly.
That is not poetic, Tom.
Sorry.
That is not romantic, but
I guess
it's real. It's probably reality, but
well, they did have those rows of gas lights, I think, to even it out, and everybody looks good in gas lights.
And yet, even with Liberty's Arm and the arc lights and the theaters, the park's central attraction by this time was actually at its northeast corner, over at East 26th and Madison Avenue.
That would be the location of the old train depot that I mentioned a few minutes ago.
Right. Now, with the opening of a new Grand Central Depot further north on 42nd Street in 1871, this depot, it wasn't needed anymore. So in steps impresario P.T. Barnum, who took the property in 1874, sort of refitted it inside so to be kind of like an amphitheater, and parked his traveling circus and museum inside. The so-called Grand Roman Hippodrome, bringing that tradition back. I know. And that also had animals and acrobatic acts, as grand, if not more so, than Francone's own Hippodrome. Now, as we know, this was only temporary because Barnum was to soon take his show on the road, revolutionizing the American circus. And so then the space was taken up in 1875 by the band leader Patrick Gilmore.
Gilmore, who is famous for writing the lyrics to that old war song, When Johnny Comes Marching Home Again. Hurrah, hurrah.
Hurrah. And they were shouting hurrah, I imagine, when Gilmore constructed a fabulous entertainment venue here, which he then named for himself, Gilmore's Concert Gardens. Now, because he was a conductor and not a circus man like Barnum, his building was actually a step up. It was classier. It was a step up architecturally. From a description in the Brooklyn Times-Union, quote, passing through the main entrance, flanked by casts of winged human-headed bulls of Assyria, the visitor passes up graveled walks through a clump of fragrant evergreens and is ushered into a scene of almost bewildering beauty. Before him stretches out a garden with serpentine walks, beds and banks of flowers, trees, the whole illuminated by long rows of lights spanning the great structure and shining through their globes of colored glass like arches of gems of which one reads in fairy tales, unquote.
Wow. So this was literally a garden, right? Back in the day, these venues were also called pleasure gardens. They offered both a mix of plants and flowers and park space, and entertainment. So that
Yes.
connection was obviously still strong here.
Yes, in the Gilded Age. And it was in Gilmore's time it was in Gilmore's new garden here where music mixed with sports, because the venue would eventually host equestrian events, archery, and perhaps most notably of all, in the spring of 1877, the very first Westminster Kennel Club dog show.
So you're telling me that in 1877, we had the Statue of Liberty's arm on one side of the park at the same time as the Westminster Dog Show on the other at Madison Square Garden. It's really too bad that they couldn't bring those two events together somehow.
Well, actually, they kind of did. They kind of did indirectly in 1886 when the Statue of Liberty was finally dedicated in New York Harbor, and the band playing at that dedication was, of course, the band of Patrick Gilmore. So there was like a tie-in at some point, right? Yes. So anyway, everybody by this time coming up here, they knew it as the Garden, right? They called it the Garden. We're going to the Garden, right? Mm-hmm. So when Gilmore moved on by the late 1870s, the Vanderbilts, who owned this land, of course, from the Depot days, decided to keep it going. It was a good moneymaker. In fact, they would get Barnum to bring his circus back in town from time to time to perform here. But with Gilmore gone, the venue needed a new name. From the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, May 22nd, 1879, quote, "The name of Gilmore's Garden has been changed to Madison Square Garden, and its appearance has been so altered as to make it unrecognizable."
But even though it was heavily altered, it was still essentially that same old train depot.
Pretty much up until around the year 1889, when Madison Square Garden was rebuilt from the ground up and at a very rapid pace, with a new structure befitting the grandeur of New York during the Gilded Age. This new garden, designed by Stanford White of the leading architectural firm McKim, Mead & White, featured a grand 249-foot tower topped with a statue of Diana, as well as a concert hall, a swimming pool, a shopping arcade, and a roof garden.
Now, we have a couple of great shows in our back catalog all about Madison Square Garden.
Yes.
So we really don't need to list off right now all of the 19th century sporting events and galas that happened here, but I do need to draw attention to that roof garden you mentioned and to our episode number 188 called The Murder of Stanford White, because it was up on that roof garden that he had designed that on the evening of June 25th, 1906, during a performance of Mam'selle Champagne, that Stanford White was murdered by Harry Thaw, due in part to White's relationship with Thaw's wife, Evelyn Nesbit.
That crime, sometimes called the crime of the century, is also often seen as the end of the Gilded Age by some people. It drew international attention to this corner of the park. But I'd say the park, by this point, was already entering a new phase by the early 20th century.
We'll get to the things that happened in Madison Square Park in the 20th century right after this. So you just dangled the prospect of a new phase for the park at the beginning of the 20th century, and indeed it was a new, taller phase for the park, and really for much of Manhattan.
Oh yes, here come the skyscrapers, the skyscraper race even. It was happening all over the city, fueled by new construction techniques, of course, like steel frame construction, and the development of faster passenger elevators.
Yes, taller and taller office towers were being constructed all over the city, creating a new skyline for New York. And in the early years of the 1900s, several notable skyscrapers went up right here around the park.
Like at the same time that Stanford White's second Madison Square Garden was packing in crowds across the park. So that's the landscape in which these towers are rising.
Yes, exactly at the same time, because in 1901, that funny triangular block that is bordered by 22nd Street, 5th Avenue, 23rd, and Broadway in the park's southwest corner, that block was sold off to the Fuller Company, a construction company that was founded in Chicago by George Fuller in the 1880s, which had really pioneered the use of steel frame construction and had even earned George Fuller the sort of honorary title of being the, quote, inventor of the modern skyscraper.
And his firm, the Fuller Company, along with the architect Daniel Burnham, were instrumental in the development of the Columbian World Exposition of 1893, the Chicago World's Fair. So they were like big deal. They were big deal developers. They were big deal developers by this time.
And by 1901, their company, the Fuller Company, which had been based in Chicago, decided to build their New York headquarters right here at 23rd and 5th Avenue on that funny plot of land that was shaped like a triangle or shaped like an antique clothes iron. This new building was designed by Burnham along with Frederick Dinkelberg. And thanks to that, steel frame construction, it was able to rise 20 stories into the air, and it went up quickly. It was finished and opened in 1902, and then covered in limestone and terracotta. It's a gorgeous building, obviously. And although it was technically named the Fuller Building, it quickly became known around the world. It quickly became known around the city and really around the world as the Flatiron Building.
I love that they were showing off a little bit. Like they were coming in saying, our first building is going to be on this strange plot of land, right? And it's going to almost immediately become an iconic part of the New York landscape. Yeah. As in like, it actually like represents Madison Square Park. When you search for photos of Madison Square Park, it's almost hard not to find photos that include the Flatiron in them.
Either the Statue of Liberty's arm or the Flatiron. And the public agreed. The public found it gorgeous as well. Although there was early on a generally held fear that maybe, that shape created a kind of instability. How could it even stand up? How could it go so high and be so narrow, at its corners? People were afraid that the building itself could blow over. It was just so dainty and pretty. How could it stand?
Yeah, I mean, New Yorkers knew it had been constructed with a steel skeleton, not what they were used to, with an old-fashioned thick masonry walls. There just weren't that many steel buildings at this time.
And so everybody feared what would happen, if a big windy storm blew into town, which is exactly what happened on September 16th, 1903, just a year after the Flatiron had opened. Wind gusts that were stronger than anyone could remember ripped through the area, and all eyes turned toward Madison Square. From the next day's New York Sun, quote, "Flatiron stood like a rock. The Flatiron Building weathered the storm in great shape yesterday. A great deal of fiction has gotten into print about the skyscraper, but the hardest roast it ever got came yesterday from an evening paper which solemnly said that the storm had broken every window in the building and that the tenants were moving out. The manufacturers of glass will no doubt be pained to hear that the first part of this yarn is untrue, and so is the second part."
Pained to hear. Did I just sense a pun in the New York Sun? I'm very impressed by that writer. However, even smaller winds, we experience them today. They could come ripping around that intersection.
Oh, yeah.
Back then, sometimes even blowing up women's skirts to, reveal their legs, which was very scandalous. And according to legend, led to the popularization of the phrase 23 skidoo.
Right, because policemen allegedly patrolled that intersection pushing male onlookers away with their sticks, giving them the old, quote, 23rd Street skidoo. But despite all of these corny antics taking place here at 23rd and at the Flatiron, the completion of the Flatiron Building also signaled, a more business-focused era for the park and for the neighborhood. This had been the hub of society, as you mentioned, during the Gilded Age, but now, in early years of the 20th century, the park was now anchored by a construction company. Mm-hmm. And the whole area had started to attract more office buildings, and small manufacturing, factories, especially in the garment trade.
This would be something that some Fifth Avenue business owners who, wanted to keep that upscale, luxurious vibe that was going on here, they attempted to fight it off. And they were actually successful in pushing much of the garment industry away, of course, north and west between 23rd and 34th, and that old notorious Tenderloin area. Like, they could have the garment industry, but let's keep it fancy around here.
Yeah, but they couldn't keep, high society from marching farther up Fifth Avenue. The Flatiron opened in 1902. But Mrs. Astor had already built her new mansion on 65th and Fifth Avenue in 1896, right? By the time that the Flatiron opened, the area north of 42nd Street was already home, to new theaters. The city was moving up.
Although, some entertainment was still around here in the early 20th century, including, of course, obviously, Madison Square Garden, which would continue to operate until 1925.
Sure, but even they couldn't ignore, that things were becoming more businessy all around it, right? Even before the Flatiron opened, the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company had opened an 11-story office building just off the park in 1893, actually on the part of the block that faces Park Avenue between 23rd and 24th Street. But that building, that 11-story building, would not be enough for such a growing company.
Well, I was going to say, just as insurance companies today use catchy mascots to promote their insurance companies, back in the day, they used skyscrapers.
Yeah.
So while I'm sure that old building was great, they needed something bolder.
And taller. And they wanted it right there, adjoining their offices that they had already built. But there was just one problem. The Madison Square Presbyterian Church was already there. And its minister, the Reverend Parkhurst, had been railing against the vice, that was taking place in brothels all over the neighborhood from his pulpit in his church.
Oh, yeah. And we did a whole show on Dr. Parkhurst's campaign, his exploratory voyages into the underworld back in a show in 2021. But this was an important church. I mean, you can't just move a church. You can't roll this on logs anywhere, can you?
Well, if you're MetLife, maybe you can pay them to move, which is exactly what happened. The church, which was, right up against their other building there, had been sensing the pressure and sensing how the neighborhood had been changing. And so they sold out to Metropolitan Life Insurance, which then demolished the Gothic Revival Church, and in its place, the architectural firm of Napoleon Lebrun and Sons designed a 700-foot marble-covered tower that was modeled after the Campanile Tower in the Piazza San Marco in Venice. Although I should add that at 49 floors tall, Greg, this tower is more than twice as big as the Venetian Tower in St. Mark's Square.
Well, you got to add that American touch by making it larger. So take that, Flatiron. And unlike the Flatiron, this had a clock on it.
Very practical, yes. So the Flatiron opened in 1902. The MetLife Tower construction began in 1905 and was completed 4 years later in 1909. And when it opened, it took over the title of being the tallest building in New York from the Singer Building downtown. And it would hold that title for 4 years until 1913, when the pesky little when that pesky Woolworth building took over.
But whatever happened to the Madison Square Presbyterian Church that had once been here? Did they move? Did they just close up shop forever?
No, they actually jumped across 24th Street and stayed on the park. And in 1906, they built a new church that was designed by Stanford Whites in the high Renaissance style with a giant dome and Greek columns out front, and was constructed for, a whopping sum of $500,000.
But, I mean, that church isn't there either today.
No, because MetLife soon needed to expand again. They had filled up that tower and the other offices. And so in 1919, the company purchased that church as well and demolished it in order to build another office tower, the 30-story North Building, which is an Art Deco office tower that is located between 24th and 25th, which is today home to Credit Suisse, as well as offices for Sony.
It's almost like the church needed insurance for the encroaching development. Do they sell that kind of insurance today? They should.
Well, I think that they were paid handsomely for the inconvenience.
So that MetLife North Tower opened in 1919, and then just a block away on 26th Street, you still have Madison Square Garden.
Yes, which would continue operating until 1925. The Daily News reported on May 6, 1925, Madison Square Garden, Manhattan's most interesting landmark, today is being converted into ruins. A bit of old New York that holds a rich lore of great events, dramatic and tragic, passes into history.
It would take that name, and a new iteration of Madison Square Garden would open on 8th Avenue and 50th Street.
Yes.
And so what was it replaced by?
The mortgage on the garden here was held by another insurance company, the New York Life Insurance Company. And, maybe they were casting an eye down the block at MetLife, but they decided to build themselves a new headquarters right here on the spot. And so Cass Gilbert, the architect of the Woolworth building downtown, designed a 34-story office tower right here on the spot of the old Madison Square Garden, topped with a gilded, 6-story pointed rooftop. The building was completed and opened in 1928.
And I must say that gold roof is very eye-catching.
Oh, it pops. It draws your eye right there to the spot of the old Madison Square Garden and to the old New York and Harlem Depot. And New York Life still occupies the building today. But by the time it opened, just before the Depression, Madison Square and its park had really been completely transformed. By the 1930s, the center of cultural life in the city had long before moved on.
But the park did adopt a personality more akin to Union Square and Washington Square as a place of protest and rallying, even at times seeing contentious gatherings between protesters and police. Perhaps one of the most significant mass gatherings here at Madison Square occurred on July 30th, 1944, drawing many thousands of Jewish Americans who heard a speech from several officials and even a telegram from President Roosevelt. From the New York Times, quote, declaring its fear that by the time the war had been won, the largest part of the Jewish population of Europe will have been extinguished. A mass meeting of 40,000 American Jews gathered in Madison Square Park yesterday afternoon, adopting a resolution embodying a program for saving as many Jews in the Nazi-occupied territories as possible, unquote. And there were many, many more gatherings of this type well into the 1950s and 60s.
So on one hand, this demonstrates that the park has become even more of a people's park, by this time, not an elite spot like it was in the Gilded Age days. But by this time, 70 to 80 years after this redesign that you had mentioned, I wonder if the park was kind of falling apart a bit.
Yeah, it was It was beat up. It was in pretty deplorable condition by the 1930s. There had been many plans to improve it over the decades, but few of them were carried out. And so that left the park vulnerable to more, shall we say, destructive ideas. For instance, in the 1960s, they almost constructed a parking garage underneath the park.
Wow, what a modern concept.
Underneath the park, they almost built a city-owned parking lot, a project which would have closed the park for several years. The neighborhood did successfully push back because of the trees, right? Many of the trees here were over a century old, even much older than that, and those trees would have been damaged or uprooted. Many thought it would make traffic and congestion worse for the area. To quote one letter writer from the New York Times, quote, "What New York City now needs is not to attract more private cars to this Midtown section, but to discourage them," unquote.
Did you say this was from 1960, from like 60 years ago? This is extremely modern. I mean, that could have been written 6 months ago.
What goes around comes around with these ideas. Meanwhile, other catastrophic changes were occurring around the park, as you could imagine, in the 60s and 70s. Believe it or not, that old Leonard Jerome mansion of the Cologne and Champagne fountains was still sitting at 26 in Madison. But in 1967, it was slated for demolition.
It's kind of a miracle that it was still standing at that point. But at least by 1967, right, it had the newly formed Landmarks Preservation Commission to help protect it.
And they tried to save it. They really did. They even designated it for preservation and desperately searched for a new owner to come in and sort of like be the hero here. You know, the exact same battle was occurring just a few blocks downtown at the old Astor Library, another centuries-old building that was about to be demolished. In that case, they found a buyer in the form of theater impresario Joe Papp. Mm-hmm. But the Jerome Mansion and its former fountains, no such luck. From the New York Times, October 5th, 1967, quote, "The 100-year-old Madison Square home of Leonard Jerome, Sir Winston Churchill's grandfather, will be razed to make way for a skyscraper," unquote.
Alas, there was no Calvin Klein escape
No.
for the Jerome Mansion. Today, that's the spot where the glass-towered New York Merchandise Mart now stands. Ugh.
Mm-hmm. Now, a very tragic incident occurred on the south side of the park just a year before, on the opposite side of the street at the corner of 23rd and Broadway. An art gallery on 22nd Street had caught fire on the evening of October 17th, 1966. Firefighters attempted to battle the blaze by actually entering a store on the 23rd side, a store called Wonder Drugs. But unfortunately, the fire had spread through the shared cellar area, weakening the floor within the drugstore. The floor collapsed beneath the men and threw them into the inferno below. In all, 12 firefighters died in this terrible tragedy, the greatest loss of life in the New York Fire Department's history before September 11th, 2001.
And on the building that stands there today, there's a plaque that pays honor to those who died in this terrible blaze.
Now, I'd like to take us back into the park during the 1990s, a decade of tremendous transition. By this moment, the whole neighborhood had slipped greatly from prominence, and by the late 1980s, it was perhaps best known. And by the late 1980s, the park was perhaps best known as the site of drug deals. And there was even a homeless encampment here at the park when the city forced people out of other parks. And so there was no other place for them to go, so they came here. Many of the former hotels around the block, meanwhile, well, they had long since closed, of course, and many turned into shelters for homeless families. Hotels such as the Prince George up on East 27th Street, one block north, which was built in 1904, but by this time was now a homeless shelter and took in thousands of people in the 1980s.
So Madison Square Park then was really reflecting a lot of the problems and challenges that the entire city was facing.
Yeah. Well, but the park, by the mid and late 90s, would bounce back. In 1997, a real effort was made to restore the park, thanks to a nonprofit organization called the City Parks Foundation, which had formed for the needs of all city parks in 1989, and then brought together these private and public funders to rehabilitate Madison Square Park to the condition that we more or less see today, and that work was completed in 2001. Among the features were a rehabilitated fountain on the southern end, and then that reflecting pool was constructed on the north side. And not to diminish the work of the many activists, city planners, and architects who all worked tirelessly to restore the park, I do want to focus on one contributor to the restoration efforts, a restaurateur named Danny Meyer.
Restaurant icon, I think
Yes.
you could say. Danny Meyer, who by the mid-1990s was already quite famous, right, for two other hot restaurants in the area, the Union Square Cafe and the Gramercy Tavern.
So Meyer obviously believed in this whole area, and just his presence alone propelled Madison Square and the whole area of the Flatiron District, propelled it as a sort of hot foodie destination by the late 1990s. In 1998, he opened 11 Madison Park on the ground floor of the MetLife North building. To this day, it remains one of New York's most famous and exclusive restaurants.
I was going to say, I'm still waiting to get a table.
Yeah, I think so.
And we almost have the same last name. Although Danny Meyer's no longer involved, although the restaurant is still going strong, still sort of the gold standard of eateries in New York.
Not that we would know that firsthand, but we are familiar, however, with another Danny Meyer project within the park. For in 2001, he hosted an upscale hot dog stand in Madison Square, which morphed by the year 2004 into a food shack known appropriately as the Shake Shack. Today, there are 400 Shake Shacks around the world, including, maybe for many people, you know, the one at JFK International Airport.
I know it well.
I know. But they all got their start here at the southeast corner of Madison Square Park.
They are truly everywhere. People are gobbling down Shake Shack hot dogs and slurping down milkshakes, you know, in Shake Shacks from London to Tokyo. And I would bet, Greg, that most of them, maybe even 99% of them, are not aware of the Shack's contribution to the rehabilitation of Madison Square Park.
I'm sure most people are not aware of that, but it's true. You know, in fact, to close out our show here, let's do a very brief walk virtually around the park, starting, as we've often done, starting here at the Shake Shack on the southeast corner of the park, okay? We walk in that entrance, standing at the Shake Shack.
Grab some crinkle fries, maybe a little ketchup.
Waiting in line for 15 minutes, whatever. Yes. So standing nearby you as you're like eating your crinkle fries is a bronze statue of a very stern man that we have discussed on the show many times. The Republican political boss, Roscoe Conkling, who was frequently at and regularly in charge of those backroom meetings over at the Fifth Avenue Hotel. Now, the statue by John Quincy Adams Ward was erected on this corner in 1893, but there's a sort of a dark story to this, unfortunately. For Conkling died 5 years previous during the brutal blizzard of 1888, trying to make his way back to a club, a social club that was nearby this spot, but he collapsed, unfortunately, in Union Square and then died later.
So why is he standing here?
Well, to be perfectly blunt, this is their thoughts, not my own. He wasn't important enough for Union Square. To quote from a 1908 journal, quote, The question was then very naturally raised as to how important a man must be in order to be truthfully called a, quote, great American and be worthy of having his monument placed in a public square of the great city, unquote. Union Square at this time already had George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and the Marquis de Lafayette, okay? The Parks Commissioners determined that Conkling did not deserve to be placed in that fellowship, and so instead they placed him here at the southeastern entrance, okay? Now that is a little unfair to the other men who are depicted in statues in the park, perhaps most especially to the man who is sitting at the southwest corner of the park and has sat there since 1876, the former New York governor and Lincoln's Secretary of State, William Seward.
William Seward was a great man. Maybe not, in the same league as his old boss, Abe, but still great. And we should point out that there is, strangely, no statue to Seward at the park that actually bears his name, Seward Park down on the Lower East Side.
No, and no one's thought to move him from this spot. So they'll have to build another one.
Well, he is right there by the old Fifth Avenue Hotel where he's, as a Republican, spent quite a bit of time.
Yes. Now, walking north along the western end of the park here, you'll see the Eternal Light Flagstaff topped with a star-shaped lumiere in memory of those who died during World War I, however, never seemed to pay too much attention to that star because of what stands next to it. Jemmy's Dog Run, one of New York City's best small dog runs. I'm not kidding you. It really is spectacular. The park was actually famous in the early 90s for having dogs running around without leashes, which, there's a law.
Those were the old days.
But the city started cracking down in the early 90s on these rampant dogs. In fact, famously, John F. Kennedy Jr. got a ticket from the city in 1994 for having his dog out without a leash. And of course, considering the tabloids of the day, that made all the headlines.
That was big news in 94. But given
yes.
But given that this is, the spot where the Westminster Dog Show was born, was first held in the city, I think it's fair to give the, dogs their own sort of glamorous dog run right here in the park.
Maybe a future Best in Show winner will be running around there right now. Who knows?
Perhaps.
Now, if you walk inward and towards the northern side of the park, you'll pass the Great Lawn, which is often the site of some extraordinary art installations, at least since the first one in 2001. Today, the Great Lawn is maintained, as are many aspects of the park, by the Madison Square Park Conservancy, which formed in 2003. Finally, on the northern end of the park, on the other side of the playground and the reflecting pool, you'll find two statues. The first is an 1881 monument to Admiral David Glasgow Farragut, designed by Stanford White and Augustus St. Gaudens in his first public commission. The second statue stands over the northeast corner of the park, a statue of our 21st president, Chester A. Arthur.
Chester A. Arthur, New Yorker.
And was actually sworn in for office a few blocks away. But on a final note here, I want to lead us out of the park into those blocks north of Madison Square.
Or today known as NoMad.
Cute nickname aside, this area north and slightly west of the park was made a distinct historic district in 2001 due to so many of those historic hotels and social club buildings that remain intact. And this has led to a new wave of boutique hotels, fabulous restaurants, and even several rooftop bars, in a nod to the old Madison Square Garden. That name, by the way, NoMad, was first used in the New York Times in 1999.
Really? Wow. For more than 20 years. I still haven't really gotten used to it. Do you call it NoMad?
I begrudgingly call it that now, because I often go there now, actually. It's a
True.
fun place. In 2012, Adam Sternberg of New York Magazine wrote, quote, "How do you make a neighborhood? Can you conjure one out of thin air?" If the crowds at the Ace Hotel are any evidence, then yes, you can. Sort of, at least for a moment. The Ace opened officially 1 year ago, and it's now the heart of the district called NoMad, insofar as any such neighborhood exists. Like Never Neverland, NoMad is a place that can only be visited if you believe in it hard enough, unquote. I love that quote.
Well, I believe in it. I mean, at least now I do. And I remember, it was a big deal when the Ace opened. And you could go and have coffee or drinks and cocktails, in
Manhattan's.
In Manhattan's, in this fabulous old school space. That was a big deal. And and I even stayed at the James Hotel when I was in town for the Halloween show. So I stayed in NoMad, Greg. So, really what's extraordinary is that today's area, around Madison Square Park is really in many ways a throwback to the Madison Square, of the 1880s.
Except that there are subways and cars, and Lady Liberty took her arm with her. For more information, we highly recommend visiting the website of the Madison Square Park Conservancy and also the site of the Flatiron NoMad Partnership. And we have a little challenge for you, listener. If you've made it this far, we think you might enjoy this. Head over to Madison Square Park and the area, Flatiron NoMad. If you live there or you're visiting, post images on your preferred social media of choice and tag us, okay? That's Bowery Boys on Twitter and Threads, Bowery Boys NYC on Instagram. Look us up. We will share as many images and videos of Madison Square Park as you send us.
And of course, head over to our website, BoweryBoysHistory.com. We'll have many images of the park, past and present, many from actually our own past, Greg, because you once lived there and worked there.
Yeah, back in the pre-NoMad period, I did live there. In fact, if you want to hear Tom and I talk more about Madison Square Park, this podcast isn't long enough, actually join us on patreon.com where we release our Patreon-only show called Side Streets. And this latest episode will be our adventures in Madison Square Park, NoMad, Flatiron, and the whole area. And we did have some adventures, didn't we, Tom?
I believe that you saw a big budget Hollywood monster movie that was being filmed in the park in the mid-1990s, if I recall.
Yes. Maybe we'll talk about a little place called Champs.
Oh, we're going to talk about Champs on Side Streets?
That's Flatiron. That's Flatiron District.
You can hear that and more by joining us over at patreon.com/BoweryBoys.
Thanks to everyone who supports us there with a small monthly donation. We really do appreciate it.
We do. Thank you so much. And thank you also to those of you who have joined us in the streets over at BoweryBoysWalks.com. Our professional, fabulous tour guides lead small group walking tours open to the general public and for private groups and organizations of all different neighborhoods of New York City, including a tour around the Madison Square Park area. We have new tours that we're rolling out this spring, and we're very excited to announce them. So you can see the latest tours along with the hottest tours in town, the Gilded Age Mansions of Fifth Avenue tours. Head over to BoweryBoysWalks.com to join us in the streets and walk through time.
So thank you very much for joining us on this in-depth history of Madison Square Park. We just couldn't help. We couldn't help ourselves. We could not help ourselves with this. It's too much a part of our existence in the city. So thank you very much for listening. Have a great New York week, whether you live here or not.
See you real soon.